Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
This is Frank Agin, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections, and I'm your host of the Networking RX podcast. Welcome back for another episode. Before we get started, remember, we're looking to add quality people to our stable of franchisees. This is a unique franchise opportunity in that it's geared for an aspiring entrepreneur or professional to add on to what they're already doing. Again, all of our franchisees do something else for just a couple hours in the morning, a few days a week. Our franchisees operate the AmSpirit Business Connections franchise program. The rest of the week, they're accountants, attorneys, financial advisors, realtors, coaches, and consultants of various kinds. If you're interested, contact me. There's an email in the show notes, or use the one provided at the end of the podcast. Clear and effective communication is essential during any presentation. And as we know, presentations come in all shapes and sizes. We present to colleagues, we'll present to superiors, we'll present to subordinates. We have formal presentations, and then we have informal presentations. Presentations can be to groups of just a few, up to several hundred. Now, when most of us think of presentations, we might think of someone standing before an auditorium of, let's say, several dozen, and the person's delivering a well-polished program. And many of you might think, well, that's not me, I'd never do that. Perhaps not. Formal public programs might not be your thing, and that's fine. Nevertheless, you still do presentations. You might not think of it this way, but you do presentations of a sort every day. In fact, I would venture a guess that the vast majority of the presentations you give are of the variety that are unscripted, completely informal, and delivered to a minimum audience of one. Yep. When you stand in front of or sit across from someone and have a conversation, make no mistake, you're presenting. It might not be to a boardroom full of executives, or at a conference before your peers, or in a classroom before dozens of fidgety teens or overly judgmental college students. Nevertheless, you're presenting. As such, clear and effective communication is just as important as if you were standing before an auditorium full of people. So being clear and effective requires mastery of two things: verbal and nonverbal. Verbal is what comes out of your mouth, and it's important. Choosing the right words and weaving them together using the appropriate King's English or something close to that can make a difference between failure and flop. Nonverbal is arguably just as important, maybe more so. After all, you could choose all the right words and say them all the right way and somehow not be heard. In fact, researchers Alan and Barbara Pease, they're co-authors of the book, The Definitive Book of Body Language, and experts on nonverbal communications found that, this is in their research, found that 83% of communication is nonverbal. That's a significant percentage. To be honest, that's what makes webinars and podcasts like these a challenge. I can't convey body language. I'll tell you that I stand to do these episodes as I find it helps me with delivery versus sitting down. But that aside, other than voice inflection, much of my non-verbal communication is lost. And you have to trust me, it's here. Additionally, I can't read the audience's body language. I can't see how these remarks hit you. I can't see if people are engaged or if I'm losing you. I can't see if something I've said doesn't make any sense at all. So again, webinars and podcasts are challenging for this reason. Not impossible, but a challenge. So 83% of communication is nonverbal. How might that impact what your audience recalls or doesn't recall? And having a network remember what you said is important. If you remember back to episode 19, creating networking recall, Now you might want to go back and give it a listen or another listen, but the premise of that entire episode was to be known, liked, and trusted, one must be remembered. And in that episode, I offered 5 tactics to ensure that you're remembered. However, none of those 5 were really nonverbal. So to what extent does nonverbal impact recall? It's a good question. And I didn't have the answer until I stumbled upon an article in Entrepreneur Magazine by Dustin York. This goes back a few years. He's an assistant professor of communication at Maryville University. He knows, as we do, that verbal information is vital, but he was also unsure as to whether or not how we present that information, aka nonverbal communication, can determine how much an audience remembers. So he conducted an experiment, naturally on his students. They're there, they're free. So he had 4 identical university classes with a total of 80 students. Each class had a guest speaker who presented. 2 of those guest speakers presented using effective nonverbal communications, while the other 2 used poor nonverbal communications. You're controlled for all the obvious variables. Each presentation was exactly the same, word for word. The PowerPoint presentation was the same, slide for slide. And the presentation length was the same. The only difference were 5 nonverbal tactics. The first, eye contact. The effective nonverbal instructor tried to make eye contact with each student throughout the presentation. The poor nonverbal instructor looked at the PowerPoint and minimally glanced at the students. The second nonverbal was voice fluctuation. The effective nonverbal instructor varied his voice patterns throughout the presentation. The poor nonverbal instructor kept a moderately monotone vocal range throughout the whole program. The third nonverbal was position in the room. The effective nonverbal instructor used a PowerPoint clicker and walked around the room as he presented. The poor nonverbal instructor stood behind a podium and used the desktop computer mouse to navigate the entire PowerPoint presentation. The fourth was facial expressions. The effective nonverbal instructor used a variety of enthusiastic facial expressions, whereas the poor nonverbal instructor kept a moderately flat expression throughout the program. Finally, the fifth nonverbal was hand gestures. The effective nonverbal instructor continually showed the palms of his hands during gesturing, whereas the poor nonverbal instructor kept his hands on the surface of the podium. Following the program, York gave each class the same test, which questioned them about the information they were given during the presentation. Now, before I reveal those results, let me share what a couple students said about their experience, which was done during a focus group that immediately followed the lectures and the testing. One of the students who was in the effective nonverbal communication class said, "Sometimes when presenters are speaking, I just won't pay attention because I'm bored. But I paid attention to this one." Whereas a student in the poor nonverbal communication class said, "I got distracted easily with doodling on my paper. I listened to the first half, but I don't remember anything from the second half." As for the results, with these comments, I'm sure you could hazard a guess as to which group retained more information from the lecture. The effective nonverbal communication class did. It remembered much more. In fact, those in the effective nonverbal communication class scored almost 30% higher on the test than the students in the poor nonverbal communication class. 30%. I don't know about you, but I don't want the people I communicate with to forget or otherwise dismiss 3 of 10 things I say. So the next time you're giving a presentation for a client or at a conference or just talking to someone one-on-one, remember how you say what you're saying is arguably far more important, 83% versus 17%, than what you actually have to say. So here's my commentary on the nonverbal items that York manipulated with his test and control subjects. 1, eye contact. When you talk to someone, look at the person. I'm not talking about a staring contest. That's just odd when it happens. But don't look over their shoulder or away at something else. That's rude. Look at them in the eye, then look off as to gather your words. Look at them again and take in how they're reacting, what you have to say. Just be natural. If you're talking to multiple people, alternate looking at them in the eye or looking to different people. With respect to voice fluctuation, you don't need to be animated, changing from voice to voice like a cartoon character. But some of what you have to say should be slower and more deliberate, and some of it should be a little more anxious in tone. Add a chuckle to indicate there's some humor in there. Doesn't mean you need to laugh hysterically at your own jokes. That's a whole different conversation. But just kind of have your voice move up and down with what you're saying, beginning, middle, conclusion. As far as position in the room, yes, if you're presenting to a group, don't cement your feet to the floor, move around. If you're talking one-on-one with someone, however, generally this doesn't apply. But what I can share, and this comes from Alan and Barbara Pease's book, the definitive book on body language, if you're talking to a woman, they're more comfortable talking face to face. If you're talking to a man, they're more comfortable talking shoulder to shoulder. If you don't believe me, when you go to the next networking event, observe how men talk versus women. In fact, I once tested this. I purposely faced up to a guy when talking to him. He kept moving from out in front of me, trying to go shoulder to shoulder, and he didn't know he was doing it. He wasn't deliberate. It was kind of slowly shifting to get his shoulder next to mine, and then I would purposely move to get in front of him. It was like we were going in circles, but it was funny to kind of watch his reactions. And anyhow, 4 facial expressions. Use them. I think we naturally do. I don't think it's something you need to or can practice. I think it just happens. In fact, as I record podcasts, I can tell that I make facial expressions. It helps me deliver the material. The same for number 5, hand gestures. I make hand gestures as I talk, live in person and while recording this. It's part of the reason I stand when recording. But when I talk, I keep my hands out of my pocket and freely moving about. Beyond that, I really don't think much about what my hands are doing. But they follow a pattern, I'm sure, and they'll mimic the tone of the words coming out of my mouth or the words coming out of my mouth. Again, I don't think it's something you need to or can practice. It just happens. But don't stifle the movement. It's not distracting, just the opposite. It's really adding to what you have to say. Bottom line is this: 83% of what you communicate comes via a nonverbal form. Embrace that. You don't need to be perfect at it, but it could be the difference between being remembered or not, which could be the difference between being known, liked, and trusted or not.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.